Today, it seems like the United States and Israel were always meant to be partners, a rock-solid alliance. But history tells a different story, one filled with uncertainty, hesitation, and unexpected twists. 77 years ago, at the stroke of midnight, history was made. The first Jewish state in nearly 2,000 years was officially declared in Jerusalem. Just 11 minutes later, another announcement shook the world. The United States had recognized Israel. This decision sent shockwaves throughout the world and Washington, even among Truman's own advisors. Some members of the U.S. delegation to United Nations were so stunned that they literally broke into laughter. They thought this was some sort of a joke. They knew Truman as someone who was not supporting the creation of Israel. President Harry Truman was known for his anti-Semitic remarks. He had privately mocked Jewish leaders and complained about Zionist pressure. So why did Truman then recognize Israel? Why did a man with clear prejudice become the American godfather of Israeli statehood? Today, I'll talk about the history of the United States alliance, a partnership that is still evolving and still being challenged. Welcome to the World in Me project with Dr. Yeva Aleksanyan. Please press the like button, subscribe to our channel, leave your comments, and share our videos. You can also visit our website at www.worldinme.info and explore more about our project, read articles and facts related to our videos. Israel's recognition and partnership with the United States traces back to one man, Edward Jacobson, not a president, not a general, not a diplomat. A small-time businessman from Missouri, and yet he changed the course of history. But before we get to how he managed to turn things around, let's take a step back to the roots of this story, Zionist movement. Because without understanding the Zionist movement and the idea of a Jewish state, the story of U.S. Israel relationship would be only half told. So first of all, what exactly is Zionism? The Zionist movement began decades before Israel was founded. It was a movement fueled by fear, survival, and a vision of a homeland. In the late 19th century, as anti-Semitism surged across Europe, a new idea took hold. Jews were not just a religious group, but a nation, people with a historic right to their own state. Inspired by nationalist movements across Europe, Zionists set their sights on Palestine, a land deeply tied to Jewish history. But there was a challenge for Zionists. Palestine was already home to an Arab majority. Zionist leaders believed that in order to secure a Jewish state, they needed to establish a Jewish demographic majority. This led to waves of immigration, land acquisition, and rising tension with the local Arab population. After World War I, Western powers expressed some sympathy toward Jewish aspirations for a homeland, especially through the 1917 Balfour Declaration, in which Britain officially supported a Jewish state in Palestine. But while promises were made, no significant steps were taken to turn that vision into reality. Then came World War II, the Holocaust. In the aftermath of World War II, the horrors of Holocaust had shocked humanity. Millions of Jewish survivors had nowhere to go. The Zionist movement, which had long advocated for a Jewish homeland in Palestine, now intensified its demands. But the idea of Jewish state wasn't welcomed by everyone, of course. Arab nations fiercely opposed it, fearing regional instability. And one man standing at the center of this global storm had to make an impossible decision: United States President Harry Truman. Some claim that Truman sympathized with the Jewish struggle. He supported the idea of Jewish homeland, influenced by both biblical history and the sheer humanitarian crisis faced by Holocaust survivors. As early as 1943, he had expressed support for Jewish settlement in Palestine, but by 1947, the pressure on him was immense, and his own administration was deeply divided. Inside the White House, a battle raged. On one side, there were pro-recognition advocates led by Clark Clifford. They argued it was a moral obligation to support Israel's creation. They saw a new Jewish state as a potential democratic ally in the Middle East. But on the other side were the opponents of immediate recognition. Recognition of Israel was strongly opposed by the Secretary of State, George Marshall. Marshall feared that recognizing Israel would alienate Arab states, jeopardize U.S. access to oil, and drag America into a regional war. Truman had a decision to make: moral duty or political caution. And that's when the person I mentioned earlier appeared in the picture, Edward Jacobson. So, who was Jacobson, and how did he convince Truman to go against his own advisors and recognize Israel? Jacobson was not a president, not a senator, or a diplomat. He was a Jewish businessman from Missouri who became best friends with future President Harry Truman. Jacobson and Truman met in 1905, working together in downtown Kansas City. Their bond strengthened during World War I, where they ran a military canteen together. After the war, they tried to open a business, but it failed during the post-war recession. Despite their struggles, their friendship never wavered. Jacobson became a traveling salesman, but he never lost touch with Truman, even after his old business partner became President of the United States. Jacobson had an open access to Oval Office. When Jacobson first heard about Hitler's persecution of Jews, he spoke to Truman about it. After the Holocaust, as Jewish survivors searched for a home, Jacobson's discussions with Truman became more intense. He knew Truman could change history, but there was a problem. Truman did not want to intervene. By 1948, Truman had had enough of Zionist lobbying. He had banned any more meetings with the Zionist leaders. Truman was not going to recognize Israel, was not going to support the case of Jewish people. That was it. Truman was done. But Jacobson wasn't. On March 13, 1948, Jacobson walked into the White House unannounced. Truman saw his old friend and let him in, because after all, Jacobson had open access to the Oval Office. Jacobson didn't talk politics. Instead, he spoke from the heart. He reminded Truman of his hero, Andrew Jackson. Then he said, "Harry, I have a hero too. He's the greatest Jew alive. His name is Chaim Weizmann. He's old, he's sick, he has traveled thousands of miles to see you. And you won't even meet him? That's not like you, Harry." Truman paused. Then he agreed to meet the old Zionist leader. Days later, Truman met with Weizmann, an elderly Zionist leader. Weizmann didn't argue. He didn't pressure Truman. Instead, he made a calm, diplomatic case, one that changed history. So what exactly did Weizmann offer Truman? First, he appealed to Cold War strategy. Weizmann framed Israel as a reliable, democratic ally in the Middle East, a region where Soviet influence was growing. Truman needed allies that shared Western democratic values, where public opinion could influence leaders rather than authoritarian regimes making unilateral decisions. To the U.S., democracies were natural allies because in crisis they were more likely to stand together. So Weizmann proposed to Truman that Israel could serve as a strategic foothold for the United States in the Middle East, offering a reliable democratic ally in a region where Soviet influence was growing. There was the concern that if the U.S. didn't support the nascent state, Israel might turn to the Soviet Union for backing, potentially expanding Soviet influence in the Middle East. By the way, the Soviet Union was the first country to recognize Israel both de facto and de jure, meaning it acknowledged not only Israel's existence in practice, but also its lawful legitimacy as the state. Soviet Union was interested in Israel, and the United States knew it. Another important point in Weizmann-Truman conversation was that Weizmann knew that geopolitics was about more than democracy. It was about oil. Middle Eastern oil was a crucial resource for the West, and Truman's advisors feared that supporting Israel might jeopardize U.S. access to Arab oil. Weizmann reassured Truman that the establishment of a Jewish state would not threaten United States oil interests. Arab nations might protest, but business would continue as usual. After all, oil was too valuable for Arab leaders to simply stop selling. Then came the moral argument, one that deeply moved Truman. Weizmann spoke about the hundreds of thousands of Holocaust survivors still living in refugee camps with nowhere to go. The world had already failed the Jewish people once. Would America now stand aside again? But there was one more key argument, one that hit Truman's American instincts. Weizmann warned Truman if the United States didn't act first, Britain and European powers would take charge of Israel's future, then they might not shape it in ways that weren't aligned with American interests. It wasn't just Soviet Union influence. Truman hated British colonial influence too. He didn't want Europe deciding the future of the Middle East. So he listened, he thought, and just weeks later, he made his decision. On May 14, 1948, just 11 minutes after Israel declared independence, the United States became the first nation to de facto recognize the new Jewish state. And just like that, Edward Jacobson, through his friendship, and Chaim Weizmann, through strategy, diplomacy, and moral appeal, secured U.S. recognition of Israel. But while the birth of Israel was historic, it was far from peaceful. War erupted immediately. Arab nations rejected Israel's formation, and hundreds of thousands of Palestinians were displaced. The conflict that started then still continues today. But here is something most people don't realize. The U.S. Israel relationship wasn't as deep as it is today. At first, it was mostly economic. While Truman recognized Israel, the United States was hesitant to send military aid. In fact, the United States placed an arms embargo on both Israel and its Arab neighbors, fearing regional instability. So where did Israel get its weapons? Not from America. Instead, Israel sourced arms from Czechoslovakia, a Soviet satellite state. Yes, you heard that right. In its early years, Israel's weapons came from a Soviet ally. Then came another dent in the United States-Israel relationship, the Suez Canal crisis of 1956. I'll cover this in a separate video, but here is the short version. Egyptian leader Gamal Abdel Nasser nationalized the Suez Canal, cutting off key trade routes. Britain, France, and Israel decided to take it back by force. The United States warned them not to invade Egypt, but Israel, France, and Britain ignored the warnings and launched the attack. It backfired. Facing fierce resistance in Egypt and international backlash, the U.S. pressured Israel, Britain, and France to withdraw. This sent a clear message. While the United States supported Israel's existence, it wasn't ready to for deep military involvement. Things began to change in the 1960s when the Soviet Union further expanded its influence in the Middle East. So came the first major arms deal between the United States and Israel in 1962, when President Kennedy approved the sale of Hawk anti-aircraft missiles to Israel, marking the beginning of military partnership. Nonetheless, the United States-Israel alliance we see today didn't happen overnight. It wasn't always about billions in military aid or joint defense projects. So what changed? What turned Israel from a small, struggling state into a key U.S. ally? It all shifted after one war. In 1967, Israel was attacked by Egypt, Syria, and Jordan, three powerful Arab states. One might think this was the end of Israel. Not so fast. The war lasted just 6 days, and with Israel's stunning military victory against Egypt, Jordan, and Syria, which shocked the world. And more importantly, it changed how the United States began to view Israel. The Cold War was at its peak, and this war proved something critical. Israel wasn't just surviving, it was a military powerhouse. More than that, it could serve as a counterbalance to Soviet-backed Arab states. This marked a new era of the United States-Israel cooperation. Basically, after Israel proved itself on the battlefield, the United States saw an opportunity, not just a moral cause, but a strategic investment. Under President Richard Nixon in 1969, the U.S. significantly increased military and economic assistance to Israel. Why? Because the Soviet Union was arming Israel's enemies. If the USSR was helping Egypt, Syria, and other Arab states, then America had to back Israel. The first war where the United States directly actually helped Israel was the Yom Kippur War of 1973. To learn more about the Yom Kippur War and its consequences, watch my video below. Things improved from then on. In 1981, President Ronald Reagan officially designated Israel as a strategic ally, boosting intelligence sharing and arms sales. This wasn't just about defense, it was about technology, counterterrorism, and geopolitical influence. Then, in the late 1980s, Israel was named a major non-NATO ally, giving it unprecedented access to U.S. military and technology cooperation. Soon, Soviet Union collapsed, which changed the geopolitical landscape. No longer was the Cold War framing the U.S.-Israel relationship. Now, Israel wasn't a counterweight to Soviet allies, but it was a key U.S. partner in a changing Middle East. Then came 9/11, a turning point not just for the United States, but for global security. After the attacks, the United States and Israel found themselves facing a common enemy: terrorism. The war on terror only strengthened their alliance. Now, it wasn't about Cold War politics when the United States and Soviet Union were fighting each other through proxies, Israel and Arab states. After 9/11, it was all about fighting a new kind of enemy. Both countries aligned even more closely against Islamic extremist groups like Hamas, Hezbollah, and Iran-backed militias. The military and intelligence cooperation deepened between the countries. The U.S. and Israel shared advanced defense technology. They co-developed missile defense systems like Iron Dome and David's Sling. Intelligence sharing expanded, helping both nations prevent terrorist attacks. The United States military aid to Israel increased drastically. In 2007, President George W. Bush signed a $30 billion military aid package for Israel over 10 years, the largest in the U.S. history at a time. But that record didn't last long. Under President Barack Obama, the U.S. signed its largest ever military aid package, $38 billion over 10 years. And during the Israel-Hamas war, the Biden administration continued military support, ensuring Israel had what it needed to defend itself. But military aid is only one part of the story. Since the creation of the State of Israel, the United States has provided over $300 billion in aid, $228 billion of which is in military aid. Israel has a significant military budget itself. It doesn't just rely on United States aid, but nonetheless, the US aid is quite high. The United States also used its diplomatic powers to aid Israel, blocking anti-Israel resolutions at the UN, securing regional peace deals, and maintaining strategic dominance in the Middle East. In 2020, under President Donald Trump, the United States brokered peace agreements between Israel and several Arab nations, including United Arab Emirates, Bahrain, Morocco, Sudan, and reshaping regional alliances. The United States also helped to improve relationships between Saudi Arabia and Israel. A significant initiative in this regard was the proposed India-Middle East-Europe Economic Corridor, which aimed to establish a trade route connecting India to Europe through the United Arab Emirates, Saudi Arabia, Israel, and Greece. But then the war with Hamas broke out. There is another aspect to this relationship. Today, the United States is Israel's largest trading partner. Bilateral trade between those two countries exceeds $50 billion annually. The US imports Israeli tech, pharmaceuticals, and cybersecurity solutions. If you recently had to take antibiotics or some generic drugs, chances are high that the company that had produced them was Teva, an Israeli drug producer. Israel, on the other hand, imports American energy, aircraft, and industrial goods. And then there's technology. Israel is known as a startup nation, home to over 9,000 tech companies. Intel, Apple, Google, Microsoft all have major R&D centers in Israel. In fact, many of the chips used in our smartphones and computers are developed or produced in Israel. Israeli innovations in AI, cybersecurity, and biotech powers industries all over the world. US and Israel have co-developed cutting-edge defense tech like the Iron Dome and David Sling. Now let's talk energy. The US and Israel partner on natural gas development, with Israel emerging as a regional energy exporter. Joint research in renewable energy is shaping the future of solar and water tech. In the future, I plan to devote 2 or more videos to water and Israeli technology. Going back to US and Israel, those countries have a strong trade alliance. In fact, the US-Israel Free Trade Agreement, signed in 1985, was America's first ever free trade deal. Today, we see President Trump stopping free trade with Canada and Mexico. He did not say a single word about stopping free trade with Israel, and I don't think he ever will. Why? There are several answers to that. One, because from defense to technology, energy to finance, the US-Israeli economic relationship is currently thriving. There's another major force at play: the influence of the incredibly successful Jewish diaspora. From technology to finance, medicine to science, Jewish innovators and leaders have shaped the course of history in every corner of the world. Think about that. Facebook, ChatGPT, finance, AI, Nobel Prize winning research, Jewish contributions are everywhere. Now let's go back in time to World War I. One name changed the course of Britain's victory: Chaim Weizmann. Yes, the same Weizmann I mentioned earlier, the man who later convinced President Truman to recognize Israel. When Germany managed to cut off ammunition supplies from the US to Britain, the British Army was in crisis. Winston Churchill was desperate. They needed a scientist, someone who could develop an alternative source of ammunition. That's when Churchill turned to an incredibly talented organic chemist, Chaim Weizmann. Weizmann agreed to help, and after relentless work, he found the solution. He developed a groundbreaking process to mass-produce acetone, a key ingredient for making explosives and ammunition. Thanks to Weizmann, the British Army was rearmed and the war effort was saved. And what did Weizmann ask for in return? Not money, not fame. Instead, he advocated for the Zionist cause, strengthening his ties with British leadership, ties that would later help pave the way for the Balfour Declaration and the creation of Israel. And Weizmann wasn't the only Jewish scientist who shaped world's history. Today, the Jewish diaspora continues to influence history from Silicon Valley to Wall Street, from Nobel Prize-winning discoveries to global diplomacy, and that, of course, would also have power to influence also politics and the perception of Jews in Israel. I need to mention that regardless of political parties, many U.S. leaders, both Democratic and Republican, have seen and continue to see Israel as a key democracy in the Middle East. Of course, there is pro-Israel lobbying in the U.S., especially groups like AIPAC, American Israel Public Affairs Committee, that influences U.S. policy to maintain strong support for Israel, which is so that with the United States blessing, Israel may target nuclear and military objects in Iran. So it seems that those relationships are thriving. It does not mean there are no issues whatsoever between the two countries. When the United States wanted to normalize the relationships with Iran and sign Iran nuclear deal, Israel protested. When the US wanted to sell F-35s to Qatar, Israel strongly complained about it. But despite all above-mentioned factors, the Obama administration moved forward with Iran nuclear deal because the United States has its own interests and priorities. So there are some issues currently, and as global politics evolve, new questions will undoubtedly emerge. Whether the U.S. support for Israel will shift in the face of changing Middle Eastern alliances and how global relationships will change, only time will show. But for now, the alliance is very strong. This was the World and Me project with Dr. Yeva Aleksanyan. I hope you enjoyed our video. Don't forget to subscribe, press the like button, and leave a comment. I'll see you soon.